Welcome to Strip Cover Lit, where we squeeze the bigger picture out of literature. I'm Adrian Fort, and we are here for the first in a three-part series as we journey through Pulp by Charles Bukowski. And the first thing we're going to do is sum up what it was that we read in chapters 1 through 25.
So, what happened? Nick Billane is a dick. I mean, a private eye, a detective, not a dick. But, so, this is a noir, and we start where we have to start, in the office of the failing Dick, with musings about the fleeting nature of life when, bada boom, the bombshell appears, and what a bombshell indeed. This bombshell, she calls herself Lady Death, and she wants Celine. Celine, of course, is the famous French author. He's been hanging out at Red's bookstore, don't you know? Our gumshoe Nick Billane plays along and takes the case. Business. Then, John Barton calls. John wants the Red Sparrow, totally different than the Maltese Falcon. Anyway, Nick goes ahead and agrees to that, too. Business booming. Nick decides to go down to Red's bookstore, and as luck and the plot would have it, Celine is there. Red kicks them out because... just because. It's his store, don't you know? Nick follows Celine to the corner newsstand. At the newsstand, Celine insults the New Yorker, flips Nick the Maltese Falcon, and blows that popsicle stand. Nick tells Lady Death, then tells her Barton wants the Red Sparrow. Lady Death says get her Celine, she'll give him the damn Red Sparrow. Nick's landlord shows up to evict him for the second time, no go. Nick's bookies thugs show up to rough him up, but Lady Death just sort of manifests and drives them out. Out! Lady Death disappears. Poof! Poof! Jack Bass hires Nick to find out if his wife is cheating on him. Nick again runs into Celine at the bookstore, and then Nick trails him all the way to Jack Bass's house. I'll be damned. Nick breaks in to find Celine giving Jack Bass's wife the best insurance deal she's ever heard. There's a scuffle and an apology. Nick hightails out of there and does Nick Billane stuff for a little bit. Wait. Space Lady. There's a Space Lady. The Space Lady. Jeannie Nitro. She's haunting Hal Grover's of Silver Haven mortuary fame. No, really, it's in there, don't you know? Celine shows up at Nick's office to blackmail him. No go. Nick locks him in the bathroom. We get this quote, I had to think about all of it. Somehow it was all tying together. Space, Death, Sparrow, Stiffs, Celine, Cindy, Bass, but I couldn't quite fit the pieces together. Not yet. So, there's that. Celine then shows up at Nick's super-secret hideout, the racetrack, and hires him at gunpoint to figure out who Lady Death really is and get her off his case.
So, I've got a lot of notes for this section of the reading, and they break down into what is essentially four main topics. The first being genre. This book is dedicated, if you did not notice, to bad writing. I think that what Charles Bukowski is getting at here is he's dedicating this book to the genre of genres, to YA, to romance, pardon me, to westerns, to, of course, the noir. And as this is a love letter to bad writing, so too is it a love letter to genre writing, the writing that is not literature. And on 9 and 10, we get our first little taste of what is really at play here. This is after the bombshell has walked into Nick's office. Before she's walked into the office, this is while she's on the phone with him, she says to him, I want Celine. He says, Celine is dead. She says, he isn't. I want you to find him. I want him. I might find his bones. No, you fool. He's alive. Where? Hollywood. I hear he's been hanging around Red Koldowski's bookstore. Then why don't you find him? Nick says to her. Basically, he tells her, piss your pants and fuck yourself. And that is if we start this story exactly where we have to start, in the office with the private detective, and we have a bombshell, This is the first little hint that we are in for something slightly different. We are in for not just genre, but we are in for Bukowski's take on genre. And to further exemplify that, he asks for $6 an hour. She cuts him a check for $240. She's paying him for 40-hour work weeks. So it is interesting that it works that way, that it is a 40-hour presumed work week. Further in the story, oh, no, not further in, right at the top, Nick Billane. The name Nick Billane, which we don't get until a little further into the story, it rhymes with Mickey Spillane, which is prim and proper noir, as prim and proper as it ever were. Further on page 25, outside I moved through the smog resolutely. My eyes were blue and my shoes were old and nobody loved me. But I had things to do. I was Nicky Billane, private detective. That is as quintessential a noir quote as you will ever read. Outside I moved through the smog resolutely. My eyes were blue and my shoes were old and nobody loved me. But I had things to do. I was Nicky Billane, private detective. That is so exemplary of it's really exemplary of genre in general, as oftentimes in genre pieces, we will have little quotes that sort of summarize where we are in the story that we don't necessarily get often in what is considered literary fiction. Especially when you think of something like Hemingway. Hemingway is so sparse that for him to sum up where they are in the story at any point in time would really sort of stick out. But hold on to that idea of summing up where we are in the story, because it will come back later. But while we are on the genre still, on page 88, and this goes back to him telling the bombshell to find Celine herself, we get this quote. I got up and walked to the bathroom. I hated to look in that mirror, but I did. And I saw depression and defeat. Sagging dark pouches under the eyes, little cowardly eyes, the eyes of a rodent trapped by the friggin' cat. My flesh looked like it was trying, like it wasn't trying. It looked like it hated being part of me. My eyebrows hung down, twisted. They looked horrible. They looked as if they were demented eyebrow hairs. Horrible. I looked disgusting. That is how Nick Billane describes himself. But I want to turn now to another classic of the noir genre, Dashiell Hammett's The Maltese Falcon. This is a lovely copy that was gifted to me by one of my former professors, and Samuel Spade is described in the opening paragraph of this book. We don't get the description of Nick until page 88, but remember that description. How awful it looked. How, if you really think about it, sagging dark pouches under the eyes, little cowardly eyes, my flesh looked like it wasn't trying. You see 1,000 of those people a day, but they aren't really framed in that way. It is the framing of his character in that fashion that makes it so depressing. Framing is important. And on page 1, chapter 1, paragraph 1 of The Maltese Falcon, we get this description of Samuel Spade. Samuel Spade's jaw was long and bony, his chin a jutting V under the more flexible V of his mouth, his nostrils curved back to make another, smaller V. His yellow-gray eyes were horizontal. The V motif was picked up again by thickish brows rising outward from twin creases above a hooked nose, and his pale brown hair grew down from high, flat temples in a point on his forehead. He looked rather pleasantly like a blonde Satan. Nothing there is pleasing, but our author is sure to tell us he looks rather pleasantly like a blonde Satan, even though his hair is described as light brown. So it is the framing, ultimately, that gives us some insight to what it is that the author, how it is that the author wants us to envision the protagonist. Spade, Sam Spade here, is supposed to come across in an imposing form, pleasantly looking like Satan, pleasantly looking like a blonde Satan. That is to say, he is intimidating. He looks like he knows what he's doing and where he is going. Satan always does. But Nick has little cowardly eyes like the eyes of a rodent trapped by the cat. His flesh looked like it wasn't trying. His eyebrows hung down twisted and looked as if they were demented eyebrow hairs. Horrible and disgusting. This is an insight into how it is that our author wants us to view the protagonist, not to envision him, which is an interesting dichotomy. Not to envision him, but to think of him. The author doesn't really care how you envision that character moving forward. It is the ambiance of the character which is important after that introduction. So important, ironically, that Bukowski doesn't give us this vision of Nick until page 88. He's painting the picture of the person as he is, and then goes ahead and shows you, yeah, he is hangdog. Yeah, he is sad looking. And finally, on that first point, on page 90, Nick writes a list. Number 1, find out if Celine is Celine. Inform Lady Death of findings. 2, locate the Red Sparrow. 3, find out if Cindy is screwing around on Bass. If so, nail her ass. 4, get the space alien off Grover's back. We don't get this list until page 90. We don't get this summary of where we are supposed to go moving forward until page 90, when the first 25 chapters ends on page 102. So it is telling of the character and where the character's mind is, that it is not until nearly the middle of the book that he even really understands what it is that he's agreed to with all of these agreements. The second main point I want to talk about is literature in the book. If this is dedicated to bad writing, what are we saying about other types of writing? What are we saying about the quote-unquote literature? And on page 12, this is Lady Death speaking about Celine and the bookstore that he frequents. Well, he's been hanging around Red's bookstore, browsing, asking about Faulkner, Carson McCullers, Charles Manson. She just slips Charles Manson in there. Charles Manson with Faulkner. So this is sort of, look, books reference books, movies reference movies, songs reference songs. Whenever they go the other way, it is considered gimmicky, unless it is movies that reference literature. I don't know if you've ever noticed that. When literature talks about movies, it's sort of frowned upon. When music talks about movies, well, what are you doing, trying to get your way onto the soundtrack? When songs reference books, it is there is a band called As I Lay Dying. They're not very good, but it is a literary reference. They are sort of a genre band that is referencing literature with the capital L. But in that magic moment, when a movie references a book or a poem, we grant it. It is interesting to me. But it is also telling of our story that one of our characters, Lady Death, who is obviously, so obviously, infatuated with literature. She mentions having had Hemingway a few lines later here, that she's willing to slip Charles Manson into that little spiel. On 16, another literary reference. Then he turned to a fellow thumbing through the first edition of You Can't Go Home Again. You Can't Go Home Again by Thomas Wolfe was published after his death. This isn't necessarily something worth noting. It's just something that I thought was funny. You Can't Go Home Again was published posthumously for Thomas Wolfe. Bukowski died in March of 94, and Pulp was published in 94, but it was slightly before his death. So it is just almost ironic that that is slipped in there in that way. John Barton wants the Red Sparrow. The Red Sparrow is an almost too obvious allusion to a Maltese Falcon, if you ask me. But here is the thing there, which has not paid off yet. There is no payoff for this yet, but it is, I think, worth watching for moving forward. Falcons represent victory and dominance. They are ruthless, and they are very, very skilled in their craft of killing. That is the Maltese Falcon. Sparrows represent love and community. Now again, these are classic definitions of what these birds represent, but it is always open to the text to take and redefine what that symbol might mean. In the Maltese Falcon, we very much stick to that classic definition of what's going on there with a falcon being the symbol. The sparrow here, Nick is often alone. Nick is often driving people away. Nick is often abusing someone. Nick is often in public observing others by himself. So it is going to be interesting moving forward to see where the idea of the sparrow happens forth. Penultimately, on the point of literature in the book, on page 18, as mentioned earlier, the fellow, was it Celine, was standing at the newsstand reading a magazine. When I got closer, I noticed it was the New Yorker. He put it back on the rack and looked at me. Only one problem there, he said. What's that? They just don't know how to write. None of them. The New Yorker is known for being exemplary, for having literature with the capital L. This is dedicated to bad writing. What type of writer is Celine? We are led to believe that Celine is the genre type. We are led to believe that Celine is the literary fictional type of writer because Celine is coming with so much prestige. But he looks at the New Yorker and says that they don't know how to write. And Celine, the character, is existing within a genre novel. So it is interesting to see that representation. Obviously, in this book, someone like Nick would call out the New Yorker for no one knowing how to write. But Celine as well? Celine was looking around Red's bookstore for Faulkner. Celine was mentioned by Lady Death in the same breath as Faulkner. Celine was mentioned by Lady Death with the same intent as Hemingway. So it is interesting to see that at play. And finally, on that second idea on page 51, in the old days, he said, this is Celine, I believe, yes. In the old days, he said, writers' lives were more interesting than their writing. Nowadays, neither the lives nor the writing is any interesting. And this is as he is looking at a copy of As I Lay Dying. Faulkner, of course, had a very nuanced life, but even more so if you asked Faulkner himself. But it is worth noting that someone like Bukowski would slip this in there in a very wry fashion. Bukowski, of course, lived a rough and tumble life, and he was seeing literature evolve, though I think he would make the argument that he was watching it devolve into the hands of people who were able to say what literature was despite having never lived the life that literature would necessitate if you wanted to write it. If that makes any sense. Charles Baxter is the bastard that comes to mind with this. Charles Baxter is capital L literature. And every picture I've ever seen of him, I'm pretty sure he's wearing what are those sweatshirts you put on over collared shirts? I'm trying to find I've got a Baxter book that I thought I had right in reach, but yeah, right here. Burning Down the House by Charles Baxter. So let me see. Charles Baxter was born in Minneapolis and graduated from Macalester College in St. Paul. Macalester. After completing graduate work in English at the State University of New York at Buffalo, he taught for several years at Wayne University in Detroit. In 1989, he moved to the Department of English at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, and its MFA program. Now he teaches at the University of Minnesota. Baxter is the author of 12 books, because of course he is, because he's lived this type of life, including most recently Griffin New and Selected Stories, which sounds just titillating. He is the editor of The Art of Series and the author of The Art of Subtext Beyond Plot. Charles Baxter sounds to have lived a very cush life, and his prose reads very much that way. So do his essays. It's awful, and I agree wholeheartedly with Bukowski that someone like him shouldn't write. Moving on. The third thing is just random bits and pieces that do not have any payoff yet. But I thought that on 19, it was a great quote, "Hell was what you made it." And there is also a quote shortly before that, "Man was born to die." He's always unzipping his pants. Unzip, unzip, unzip. He's always killing flies. On 21, we get this. "You fool, I said zip up." All right. "I want proof positive whether this guy is or isn't. I've told you that I've got this crazy mind block on the matter. Barton recommended you. He said you were one of the best." "Oh, yes. I've been working for Barton. I'm working for Barton right now, as a matter of fact, trying to locate the Red Sparrow. What do you think about that?" "Listen, Blaine, you solve this Celine thing, and I'll tell you where the Red Sparrow is." "Oh, you will, lady?" "Oh, I'd do anything for you." "Like what, Blaine?" "Well, I'd kill my pet cockroach for you. I'd belt whip my mother if she were here. I'd stop babbling. I'm beginning to think that Barton may have given me a bum steer." "Well, you better get going. Either solve this Celine thing or I'm coming after you. Hey, wait a minute, lady." The phone was dead in my hand. I placed it back in its cradle. Ow. She had no block of any sort getting right to me. I had work to do. I looked around for a fly to kill. So we often have this juxtaposition of him unzipping his pants for nefarious reasons and being alone in his office, and being alone in his office and killing flies. What are you unzipping when you unzip your pants? You're unzipping your fly. It makes me wonder if there will be some payoff later for sexuality in general, for being I don't know how I want to say it. Unzipping your fly, and he never does anything after he unzips it. He always gets caught. So there's no sexuality there. Killing a fly is a commentary on the aimlessness, pointlessness, emptiness of life. Are the two connected? Is the loss of sexuality the loss of life? Is sex empty just like life is empty? I wonder if there is some connection there. On 26, he he talks about wasting a day. And it's so chapter 5 in its entirety is this. Unfortunately, I ended up at the racetrack that afternoon and that night. I got drunk. But the time wasn't wasted. I was cogitating, sifting out the facts. I was right on top of everything. Any moment, I'd have everything figured out. Sure. That is the entirety of chapter 5. That is the entirety of a day. I don't know if anyone watching this has ever had a drinking problem, but that is exactly how some days feel. You did things and you know you did things, and you had the aim to be productive, but you weren't. And so you talk yourself into believing you were anyway. And the entire thing is this one little paragraph that keeps rattling about in your head. Oh no, I didn't waste today. I did some stuff. There were things done. I did things. I was done. I was done with some stuff. So it is, the verisimilitude there is amazing. Moving forward, red. The idea of red will be important. There's Red Sparrows. There's Red's bookstore. Cindy Bass notes her favorite color is red when he talks to her. And I want to do this quote from 99 before the one from 85. We waited and waited, all of us. Didn't the shrink know? Oh, he's waiting in a waiting area for a psychologist. We waited and waited, all of us. Didn't the shrink know that waiting was one of the things that drove people crazy? People waited all their lives. They waited to live. They waited to die. They waited in line to buy toilet paper. They waited in line for money. And if they didn't have any money, they waited in longer lines. You waited to go to sleep, and then you waited to awaken. You waited to get married, and you waited to get divorced. You waited for it to rain. You waited for it to stop. You waited to eat, and you waited to eat again. You waited in a shrink's office with a bunch of psychos, and you wondered if you were one. I think that is a very powerful quote. I think that is a very macro quote from Bukowski himself. It plays back into the pointlessness and aimlessness of life and the question of, hey, what are we doing here? But the last point that I want to make before the fourth big point, which is, I believe, the main thrust. And this point sort of relates back to the idea of alcoholism and what it is that Nick Billane is struggling through here. And it is an extended quote, so I ask you to bear with me as I get through this, but I will do my best. Let me see where we are in this. Nick Billane is alone in bed, and Jeannie Nitro, the space woman, appears, and we get this. There was a large buzzing sound like a cloud of bees circling a disturbed hive. Then there was a flash of purple light, and Jeannie Nitro stood there. It scared the hell out of me. Scare you, Billane? She asked. Hell no, I answered. Don't you have any manners? Don't you knock before you enter? Jeannie Nitro looked about the room. You need a maid, she told me. This place is filthy. I drained my vodka and tossed the glass to one side. Never mind that. I'm going to nail your ass. As a detective, you lack 3 things. Like? Drive, direction, and detection. Yeah? Well, I'm on your game, baby. Is that so? You're sucking up to Grover's because he's a mortician, and because you want to use his dead bodies to house your alien friends in. She sat down in the chair, found one of my cigarettes, lit it, and laughed. Do I look like I'm in a dead body? Not exactly. We can create our own bodies. Watch. Again, there was a buzzing sound, a flash of purple light, and over in the corner of the room appeared another Jeannie Nitro. She was standing by my potted plant. Hello, Billane, she said. Hello, Billane, said the Jeannie Nitro sitting in the chair. Hey, I said. You can be in 2 bodies at the same time? No, said Jeannie Nitro in the chair. But, said Jeannie Nitro standing by the potted plant, we can leap from one body to another. I climbed out of bed and picked up my shot glass and poured another vodka. You sleep in your shorts, said Jeannie Nitro. Disgusting, said the other. I got back into bed with my drink and propped myself up against the pillow. There was another sound of buzzing, a flash of purple light, and the Jeannie Nitro by the potted plant was gone. I looked at the one in the chair. Look, I said. Grover's hired me to get you off his ass, and that's what I intend to do. You talk big for a man whose talents hover near the zero mark. Yeah? Well, I've cracked tougher cases than yours. Really? Tell me about one of them. All of my files are confidential. Confidential or non-existent. Don't get me pissed, Jeannie, or you'll what? I lifted the vodka towards my mouth. Suddenly, my hand froze 2 inches from my lips. I couldn't move. You're third-rate, Belaine. Don't play with me. And I'm being kind now. Feel lucky. Feel lucky? That was the second time I heard that within 12 hours. There was the buzz, the flash of purple, and Jeannie Nitro was gone. I sat there in bed, unable to move, the glass still 2 inches from my lips. I sat and waited. I had time to muse over my career. There wasn't much to muse about. Maybe I was in the wrong profession. But it was too late to start anything else. I just sat there and waited. In about 10 minutes, there was a tingling all over my body. I was able to move my hand just a little, then a little more. I put the vodka to my lips, managed to tilt my head and drain the glass. I tossed it at the floor, stretched out in bed, and waited once more for sleep. I heard the sounds of gunfire outside and realized everything would be all right with the world. In 5 minutes, I was sleeping along with everybody else. Did you catch it? Something very, very strange happening there. Jeannie Nitro shows up and then manifests another Jeannie Nitro. And Belaine isn't really impressed, but he's a little off-put, and he continues his drinking. He pours the vodka into a shot glass, empties the vodka into himself, tosses the shot glass away. The second Jeannie Nitro appears. He goes and gets the shot glass. She says, we can't both be Jeannie Nitro, but each one of us can be Jeannie Nitro at a time. We can create other bodies, which means we can have one full us and one empty us. There can be one of us full with us and one of us empty with nothing. It just looks the part. And she stops him. She freezes him when he's about to drain that shot glass again and disappears. To me, this screams that the liquor is Nick Belaine. One of us can be full and one of us can be empty. One of us can have some type of ability, some type of individuality, while the other is empty. As long as he's pouring the liquor into himself, emptying that shot glass, he's Nick Belaine. But when he's frozen with the shot glass on his lips, he's not really there. His power is taken from him. But the liquor's full. So I think there's going to be something more with that coming up. But I think the main thrust of this piece so far, what's in a name? What is in a name? Bukowski, the great poet, writing a pulp fiction. At the end of his life, no less. Now, one might very well make the argument that Bukowski was constantly near the end of his life. But I think that by the time 1993 and 94 came around, Bukowski would have known that time was limited. So whatever he was working on very well might be the last. But he did it anyway. He was not known for writing his books. He was known for writing his poetry. And he had some acclaim by the time he was that old with his poetry. So it begs the question, why? And I think for that answer, we need to take a step back from the text. Lady Death is dark and alluring and mysterious, and she is employing Nick Billane, the washed-up worker. Lady Death, looking for the worker. In the author, writer, and persona triumvirate that every writer is, the author is the person that we want people to see. The writer is the person who does the work. And the persona is that thing which exists in some ethereal realm. So Lady Death is hiring the writer here to find Selene. Selene, the author. So Lady Death is hiring the writer to find the author. The artiste. And Death is a fan. Death is a fan of Selene. What happens when an artist dies? We have their entire canon, and we are able to see where it is that they place in the ranks. It is often said, most famously of painters, that their work is worth nothing until they're dead. But this is for all artists, really. That's when an artist really booms, don't you know? When they're dead. So Death is making the writer look for the author. Sounds far-fetched, but we have this conversation on page 14. The phone rang. I wiped it dry with a past-due bill from the IRS and picked it up. Nick Billane, I said. Or was I Harry Martell? This is John Barton, came the voice. Yes, you've been recommending me, thank you. I've been watching you. You've got talent. It's a little raw, but that's part of the charm. Great to hear. Business has been bad. I've been watching you. You'll make it. You just have to endure. If that doesn't sound like advice between writers or between a writer and an editor, I don't know what does. I don't know what does if that does not. Then there is the conversation with Selene on 17. He put the book back on the case and just stood there looking like Selene. I looked at him. This is amazing, I said. What is? He asked. I thought you were dead, I told him. He looked at me. I thought you were dead too, he said. Then we just stood there looking at each other. The writer telling the author, I thought you were dead. And then the author replying, I thought you were dead. You haven't been feeding me. You son of a bitch, you worker bee, you. You haven't been doing your part of things, and I, as the artiste, have been left to simply wonder, while everyone thought I was dead. Red, the bookstore owner, represents a critic. And we get this. Hey you, he yelled. So if Red is the critic, Red's bookstore is the canon. Hey you, he yelled, get the hell out of here. We were the only two in there, talking about himself and Selene. Which one to get the hell out, I asked. The one that looks like Selene. Get the hell out of here. So the one that looks like the artiste, the one that looks like the author. Not the writer, but the author. The one that looks like he believes he is supposed to belong in my bookstore. Like he believes he is supposed to belong in my hall of hallowed books. So I think that some of this is borderline parable, maybe. I think that the relationship here is maybe too close to a one-to-one translation for simple metaphor. But I will not know completely on that until we finish the book and see exactly what other parts of this story would be meant to represent. But that is it for part one of this three-part series as we travel through Pulp by Charles Bukowski. I hope that you enjoyed this. I am very much enjoying this text, and I hope to see you for episode 2.